This is the entire life of Alexander Hamilton to fall asleep to. Alexander Hamilton was born on January 11th, 1755. His parents were James and Elizabeth Hamilton. They lived in Charlestown, Nevis. Alexander's father worked at an estate that grew sugarcane. When Alexander was 2 years old, his father left the family. He then had to work at his mother's estate. She grew coffee and cocoa. At night, he slept in the laundry room of the estate. When Alexander was 12 years old, there was a hurricane that destroyed all of the buildings on his mother's property. All that was left was a well and a tree. By age 13, Alexander was working as an indentured servant. He had to do hard labor for very little food. Sometimes he would get flour, pork, rum, sugar, tea, bread, and cheese. He also received a blanket, a waistcoat, and breeches. The food and goods were standard rations for servants. After working long hours at the plantation, Alexander would go to market. He would buy pens, ink, and paper. Then he would walk around the island reading books out loud to anyone who would listen. He was very smart and loved learning. At age 14, he wanted to buy a book called The London Evening Post. It cost 87 cents. This was way too expensive for him, but he still saved up the money for 2 years until he could afford it. He read the book every day. It inspired him to study law. When Alexander was 16 years old, he began working as a clerk in a lawyer's office. He studied during the evenings. After 1 year of studying, he went to court and watched lawyers argue cases in front of judges. This made him want to be a lawyer even more. He decided to leave the Caribbean and go to America to study law. He traveled to St. Croix and then boarded a boat to Boston. He shared a room with a sailor named Robert Harrison. They both worked on board the ship to help steer and navigate it. In the evenings, they would play checkers and chess. On December 17th, 1769, they arrived in Boston. Alexander found a small room near the harbor to live in. It had one window. He put his bed next to the window so he could earn money writing letters for people. He charged 10 cents per letter. He ate breakfast at a tavern. He would eat cornbread, milk, and beer. Cornbread was a staple of colonial American cuisine. For dinner, he ate cold meat pies and vegetables. Pies were popular because there was no refrigeration, so this was a good way to keep food fresh. For dessert, he ate apple pie. Apple trees grow easily in North America, so apples were very common. He met up with some friends and they started a debating club. They would meet in members' homes. They would discuss politics and current events. Some people in the group were John Hancock and Samuel Adams. They became friends with Alexander. Alexander wanted to become a lawyer, but there were no schools to teach him how to be one. So he began reading books about law. After 3 years of studying, he took the bar exam. In those days, there were no law schools or degrees, so this was the only way to become a lawyer. Unfortunately, he failed. He took the exam again the next year and passed. He was now a lawyer. He moved to New York City. He rented a large room with 10 other men. The room was used for sleeping and business. He did not have enough money to buy his own furniture, so he borrowed some from a friend. He slept on a feather bed. He also borrowed a mahogany desk and a leather chair. He worked as a lawyer for merchants. He helped them collect debts from people who owed them money. He often had to visit rural areas to find debtors. Sometimes farmers would invite him to stay at their homes while he looked for someone who owed his client money. These farmers grew wheat and barley. They would serve Alexander wheat, bread, and barley soup. He met a woman named Elizabeth Schuyler. She was the daughter of a wealthy landowner. Her father grew wheat and raised cattle on his property. He slaughtered one of the cattle and had a party to celebrate. There were 150 guests. Alexander met Elizabeth at the party. They began dating soon after. During the winter, the couple attended parties in Elizabeth's home. They ate macaroni and cheese, roasted turkey, plum pudding, and rum cake. They danced and listened to music. People wore silk stockings and velvet dresses to these parties. Men drank beer and whiskey. Women drank wine and cider. Alexander proposed to Elizabeth, and she said yes. Her father gave them permission to marry. He also gave them a dowry, which was typical in the 18th century. A dowry was money or property given to a couple for starting their new life together. With this money, Alexander and Elizabeth bought a house in New York City. They moved into the house and began furnishing it. They ordered chairs, tables, lamps, and bedding from a merchant in England. Alexander wanted to make the house look classy. He purchased 8-day clocks and marble fireplaces. He also bought pictures of famous battles to hang on the walls. Elizabeth and Alexander were married for 12 years. They had 8 children. Their first son was named after Alexander's friend, John. Their second son was named James. Their third child was a daughter. They named her Eliza. Next came Philip, then Ham, then Theo, then another daughter. They named her Maria. The last child was another son. They named him James. Sadly, their youngest son died at the age of 4. For many years, Alexander commuted to work by horse. But in 1790, he moved to a house in Washington, D.C. He then had to travel by carriage to his office. Carriages were pulled by horses. They had wheels like carriages today, but they were much slower. It took 30 minutes just to drive through Philadelphia. When Alexander was in Philadelphia, he stayed at a boarding house. He shared a room with James Madison. They talked about politics while they ate breakfast. They were both members of the Democratic-Republican Party. They opposed the policies of President John Adams. One day, Alexander got angry at a critic. He challenged the man to a duel. The two men met at dawn. Each man had a pistol and a small stick. They stood 10 paces apart. Alexander fired his pistol into the air. Then he walked over to his opponent and helped him up. That opponent was Vice President Aaron Burr. The two men walked back to where their pistols were. Alexander picked up his pistol and shot Aaron in the chest. Aaron died. 5 days later, Alexander was very upset that he killed someone. He wrote a letter to his wife. He admitted that he was at fault for the fight and apologized. He traveled back home and resigned from his job. He returned to his house in Washington, D.C. He planted a vegetable garden in the backyard. He grew cabbage, potatoes, carrots, and turnips. He ate these vegetables with every meal. He spent time with his family. He played with his sons and taught them how to read. He enjoyed watching his daughters dance. One day, he took his daughter Eliza to a party. There she met a man named George Treasury. They began dating and eventually were married. Alexander had a large library. He enjoyed reading books on politics and history. He often stayed up late into the night reading. He read books by candlelight. He kept candles burning throughout his house to make sure he never ran out. His house was robbed. Someone stole his wig, clothes, and shoes. When this happened, he was already quite poor. He could not afford to replace these things. He became very sick and died on July 12, 1804. His body was taken to Trinity Church. It was buried under the pulpit in the church. Many important people attended his funeral. They were John Adams, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, and Dolly Madison. Thank you for watching.